Okay, let's get cracking. Again, any questions, please put them in the chat. I'd like to acknowledge that I am recording this session on the lands of the Botchabaluk, Jadwa, Jadwajali, Wagai and Jabberwock peoples here in Western Victoria, in a town situated on the banks of the beautiful Wimmera River. The place that constantly reminds me of a long and deep connection with country that Aboriginal people have, spanning tens of thousands of years. As I look at the numerous scar trees along the river and surrounds, or a really powerful birthing tree on the outskirts of town. And as I ponder this deep connection with this country that Aboriginal people have, it does make me thankful to be working in a program that has such a strong focus on listening deeply to all of the Aboriginal community to ensure that we're working with Aboriginal people to change the early years service system. And as I pay my respects to elders past and present, I also thank the Aboriginal community for being willing to share experiences, knowledge and wisdom with us when historically this sharing has not always been a positive experience. I would particularly like to thank John Gorton for sharing his insight that you will see in this presentation today, but also as we introduce an improvement approach more broadly. His insight on better community engagement has really shaped the methodology used in Best Start over the past 6 years, and it's greatly appreciated. My name is Rachel Mullen, and I have been a Senior Policy Officer for the Best Start program since 2014. And our hope is that by the end of today's session, you'll have a strong understanding of what the Best Start program looks like in 2023 and how you as fund holder managers can best support your facilitators and the program to be successful. So the Best Start program's been around since 2002 and shouldn't be confused with the Best Start Best Life reforms that include the 15 hours of 3-year-old kindergarten and 30 hours of pre-prep, among other initiatives. The Best Start program has attempted to address barriers to participation in early years since its inception, although in its early days had more of a health and wellbeing focus. For many sites, the Best Start partnerships became a strong group of organisations that came together with a focus on early years. But a review of the program in 2012 identified that partnerships were largely one of two kinds: a group of partners coming together to network and share information on their work, or a partnership that primarily delivered events such as community days, literary parades, or back to school days. While both types of partnerships had perceived value in communities, the evaluation noted that it was impossible to tell the impact of Best Start on outcomes for children, particularly for those children that were experiencing vulnerability. So the review suggested two main recommendations. Firstly, narrow the focus from all children in a community to all Aboriginal children and children experiencing vulnerability, and increasing participation in universal services like maternal and child health, kindergarten and supported playgroups. So after an extensive consultation over 2 years, the Best Start guidelines were updated in 2016 to now focus exclusively on all Aboriginal children and any children experiencing vulnerability to address participation in, to address barriers to participation in key universal services such as maternal and child health, kindergarten and supported playgroups. So while the focus changed, so too did the methodology. So throughout that 2-year consultation we had with stakeholders, we simultaneously worked with experts in both children's health and development and emerging methodologies that have the power to impact outcomes, resulting in the Centre for Community Child Health, or CCCH, supporting the introduction of an improvement approach to the Best Start work. And we'll look at what that looks like as we move through this session. The 2022 guidelines were updated to include the learning we had obtained since 2016 on how the Best Start program could best use an improvement methodology in the community context. One of the big updates focused on ensuring community voice is strengthened as part of identifying the focus of the work. Another part is around the performance measures that have been added, which we'll go through again today. The purpose of briefly looking at the history of Best Start is to highlight that if you were around in the early iterations of Best Start, you would know it as a program that could be used to address virtually any early childhood role at any given time. But this is no longer the case, and we have learnt that where fund holder managers understand and support the new approach and the change facilitator role, the impact on the service system for Aboriginal children and children experiencing vulnerability is significantly more positive, and the facilitator role is used in the pre-2016 Best Start way. So this session is to ensure fund holders are really clear on the updated Best Start approach. Throughout this presentation, you'll hear from Johnny Gorton, who's been the fund holder manager at Goolam Goolam Aboriginal Cooperative in Horsham, overseeing the Dalkaya Aboriginal Best Start program for over 20 years. Johnny is a fierce advocate of the methodology Best Start now uses, at least once we incorporated the community voice into our approach in the 2020 guidelines. He and I also worked on a project together to bring this approach into the school space as well, with good success. So given his understanding of the approach and how the program works, I've asked him several questions that reflect on the program from the fund holder perspective. I first checked in on the impact of the changes in the program to using improvement methodology and how to best support the facilitator in this approach. Here are his reflections.
I guess the main impacts of the program changing was understanding the difference of improvement science methodology, being the community engagement program for all those years. It was hard to wrap my head around and understanding the improvement science methodology. So that was probably the biggest impact overall of the change of the program change. It took a little, I'm not gonna lie, it took a little bit of time for us to get to understand that. And how did we support the facilitator? It's not so much sometimes supporting the facilitator, it's actually having the right facilitator understand improvement science methodology. People, if you get a facilitator that loves data and data collection and how you collect that data, to understand how to make changes, it makes the work a whole lot easier. And it helped me having someone that had a early years background who understood what improvement science meant, so that I could learn and help her help the facilitator in her role while learning the new way of all the new changes within the program.
As I mentioned, we'll hear more from Johnny's fund holder experience throughout this session. So there's 30 Best Start partnerships across the state, with this map showing where these sites are across metropolitan Melbourne and regional Victoria. Of these, 20 sites have local governments as the fund holder, 3 sit within a health service, 1 in a community service organisation, and 6 Aboriginal Best Start sites that are operated by Aboriginal community controlled organisations. This means that the context for each site is quite unique, with a range of different organisational governance structures in place to support roles. Additionally, it does mean that fund holders have varied organisational priorities that may impact on how they would prefer the role to operate or on what partnership should focus. For example, where the fund holder is a health service, the organisation may prefer that Best Start work focus on health outcomes for children in their community to align with their organisational priorities. However, that isn't the purpose of Best Start partnerships. Partnerships are designed to work together to identify and overcome barriers to participation in kindergarten, maternal and child health and supported playgroups, with a fund holder employing the facilitator to support this work. So, of course, there may be overlap with your organisational priorities and the identified barriers to participation, in which case there's no issue with focusing on overcoming those barriers. But as we go through this presentation, it is important to remember the varied contexts in which Best Start sites operate and the variations in organisational structures that support facilitators in their work. All sites work in partnership to identify and eliminate the barriers to participation in kindergarten, maternal and child health and supported playgroups using the improvement methodology. And these are the 2 Best Start outcomes. For those of you who are familiar with the 2016 guidelines, you'll note that the optional outcomes have been removed and there's been a slight tweaking to the wording of these outcomes. So the MCH outcome has simply added the rationale for the focus, so not too much of a change there. However, the education outcome has added in the enter school as confident and involved learners, meaning that partnerships may now also focus on transition to school, if that's an area if that's something that your area is facing as a bit of a challenge. So in terms of focus groups, Aboriginal children remain the focus of all Best Start partnerships. In Aboriginal Best Start sites, the focus is exclusively on all Aboriginal children, whether they're experiencing vulnerability or not, and extends to children regardless of whether they're accessing Aboriginal specific services or other services within their community. So for example, if there's an Aboriginal specific kindergarten in a town, it's important that the Best Start work extends beyond just that service into all kindergartens in the area to ensure that Aboriginal children and their families are welcomed and supported at any service they access. Similarly, a Best Start partnership may operate in an area with a high population of children from culturally and linguistically diverse or refugee communities that are experiencing barriers to participation in kindergarten and MCH. So while it's important for the partnership to focus on those children if they're experiencing vulnerability in the area, it's also important to have a focus on all Aboriginal children, even if the number may be small. So given that all sites are focusing on Aboriginal children, I asked Johnny to reflect on how fund holders can support their facilitators to work in a culturally safe manner. And he started by reflecting on supporting a non-Aboriginal facilitator in an Aboriginal organisation.
we have a non-Aboriginal person in the role, facilitator role, and we, as an organisation, make sure that they have cultural oversight from an Aboriginal person, particularly if it's in senior management. If we've got, I'm in senior management, so I again now have the early years crew under my management. So even when I didn't, I still provided advice, not just myself, but other senior Aboriginal persons in the organisation. It's one of our remits that we have that, for Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal staff, make sure you seek cultural advice from not only internal staff, but those you also work with. So even, with the facilitators, seek advice from the CESOs, KPSA if they're Aboriginal. We don't want non-Aboriginal people to make decisions or anything like that around, what is cultural safety when they don't know. So, making sure that they always ask, even if they think they're sure, still ask anyway to make sure, because we don't, you don't want to put them in a place where they, make a mistake and then, have to feel the wrath of community if they do the wrong thing.
And ask what this looked like if it was a facilitator in a non-Aboriginal fundholder organisation.
Well, they should have some cultural oversight from the local Aboriginal org or the CESOs, or if there's Aboriginal KPSAs in the region. I'd hate to think that a local government or a non-Aboriginal org that has Best Start is not seeking cultural advice from Aboriginal persons, particularly when Aboriginal children are a heavy focus within the early years. And even with the Moral Education Plan and stuff like that. So, it'd be highly inappropriate if they were doing that.
So the other focus group is children experiencing vulnerability. The definition of children experiencing vulnerability is not prescriptive because it is often context specific. So generally, children under child protection or in out-of-home care, and children with disability or developmental delay are considered to be experiencing vulnerability. Similarly, so may some children from culturally and linguistically diverse or refugee backgrounds. It's important that partnerships use data and the professional knowledge of partners to identify the children experiencing vulnerability in their community so that barriers to participation can be identified and overcome. So the main purpose of this session is to look at how fund holders can best support Best Start facilitators. And the main way this can be done is by understanding the program and creating an authorising environment that supports this. The first and most important aspect of funding is that since 2016, Best Start funding can only be used for employing a facilitator and associated administrative costs. That's different to pre-2016 when there was brokerage funding available for things like events or production of resources. Now, funding can only be used to employ a facilitator. So 80% of funding makes up Best Start facilitators' salary and salary-related costs, such as long service leave, work cover and sick leave. And the remaining 20% is for administration costs, including supervision and development of the facilitator and capital inputs, such as office equipment, venue hire, facilitator access to mobile phone and motor vehicle, etc. Few points to note here. The Best Start facilitator role is a really complex role and it requires a lot of influencing, coaching, data analysis, etc. As such, it is often quite a senior role. So noting this, the salary itself can exceed 80% of funding if the fund holder chooses. And also we don't specify the time fraction of the role. So it may mean that 80% of funding may be 0.6 or 0.8 rather than full time, because a highly skilled facilitator may be able to fill this very complex role satisfactorily in that time fraction. It may also mean that the facilitator could be doing Best Start 0.6, say, and then funded through another funding source such as supported playgroups or CRES or something along those lines to make up the role to a full-time position. That's, from a department perspective, completely acceptable arrangement. However, the Best Start work must be evident as per all of the relevant funding requirements that we're going to go through in this presentation. It's a really important point. Unlike the facilitator salary and on costs that have some flexibility administrative costs can't actually exceed 20% of the total funding amount. So in relation to this performance measure, this is actually fairly self-explanatory, with the requirement that the facilitator is employed for at least 80% of the year. So the main obligations as fund holder here is to advise the department immediately a facilitator resigns and advertise the position as quickly as possible. So it goes without saying, outgoing facilitator that's able to provide handover to a new facilitator is the best way for somebody to understand the requirements of the role in your specific context, because we know that all contexts are very, very different. However, knowing that HR processes can take some time and it isn't always possible, supporting the facilitator to prepare adequate handover documentation has also made an incredible difference for incoming facilitators, which I'm sure is no surprise. Best Start facilitators also have access to several key documents, such as the policy and guidelines, the portal guide, the 2020 Best Start guide produced by Murdoch Children's Research Institute, MCRI or CCCH, to help facilitators understand improvement science methodology. There's also some MCRI resources that highlight promising practice and key enablers of the Best Start work that's available on the MCRI website. And finally, ensure you advise the department as soon as your new facilitator starts. So while this helps in understanding whether you've been able to make this performance measure, it also allows us to ensure that all available supports are accessed. So for example, new facilitators can currently access one-to-one coaching with MCRI after they've started. There's also portal access and support available, which will help facilitators to complete their reporting requirements. Essentially, communicating with the department around any changes to facilitators will allow us to ensure we're supporting you as best we can. Now, you'll note that the department doesn't specify any qualifications of the facilitator nor the time fraction for which they're employed. So I asked Johnny to reflect on what they've looked for in a facilitator and why, and the reason for them not employing their facilitator full-time.
I would say minimum diploma level, particularly if someone's got a diploma in early years, because the things I've learned about early years educators, they're always looking at improvements. And that's why when we hired our worker, she understood the improvement science methodology and she was a bit geeky about data. So the longer we've gone on, if we put someone in that's low level and just community engagement, you'll never get it'll take longer for them to learn about what improvement science is. And if you don't have even someone like a manager that understands that as well, it will make it even harder again. So I think a minimum level qualification, particularly in diploma in early years, so that they can understand how that, the changes within early years, the stuff that they do, helps in the transition into a Best Start role. I know that kind of doesn't make sense, but in my simple brain it does, because there's a lot to unpack when you look at early years educators and how they do their work. We employ a facilitator 0.8. That was by choice, because it doesn't, as we've talked about, it doesn't discuss in the guidelines what how long or the period, whether it's full-time, part-time, whatever. So to attract someone that's that has that level of qualification you need, the 0.8, 4 days a week can help get that person that could possibly help with the program, to be able to do what the guidelines are asking.
So if you have an extended period where there's no facilitator, the department may actually place a withhold on your funding just to ensure that you don't then require a significant recoup, given that you can only use the funding for employment of a facilitator. However, in some circumstances, you may be able to retain the funding and look to employ another person to support the Best Start facilitator in aspects of their role. So, for example, if you could potentially be employing somebody that can actively work with community members to understand barriers to participation around logic model development time, or professional development around data analysis or improvement science. So professional development's another element in addition to employing a role. So it depends on how much your underspend is. But in such instances, you have to first discuss it with your local area Early Childhood Improvement Branch, who will then liaise with us in Central and will discuss your specific circumstances. It is important to note that any underspend will need to be fully spent within the next financial year, or else return to the department, and also being really clear that it cannot be used for things like production of resources, because that is no longer funded through Best Start. The second performance measure is production of a logic model with strategies and measurable stretch goals. So more information on how to develop logic models is found in the 2020 Best Start Handbook document, and this is not the intention of this particular session. We don't want to go too deeply into the technical aspects of using an improvement approach. I'm just going to touch on a couple of things that relate as fund holders. So to summarise, a logic model should look something like this. The Best Start outcomes will be on the right. They're fixed. We've covered those earlier in the presentation, and it's what all Best Start partnerships are working toward. The target group should be all Aboriginal children, and then an articulation of whichever group of children experiencing vulnerability in the area are missing out. So, for example, it might say all Aboriginal children, then children in out-of-home care, or children living in a particular area where the data indicates that outcomes are relatively poor in that area. It's really important that this target group is identified through really robust data analysis and with feedback from stakeholders. As mentioned earlier, it can't just be a focus on the priorities of the fund holder. But one thing we have learnt from using this improvement methodology over the past 6 years is that the more time you invest at the start of logic model development in really understanding who is missing out and what their barriers to participation are, the more effective the work of the partnership. So if facilitators are able to spend time looking at all available data with partners, this is a great start. But if that data reveals that, for example, a large number of children from a particular cultural background are not attending kindergarten or MCH, then spending time speaking with that community to understand their barriers further is the best way to really strengthen the work of the partnership. It's something actually that Johnny had really championed with the department as we started to roll out the improvement methodology, and they were starting to roll it out in Horsham, because the impact was really significant once we did really consult with community properly. So it did lead to the inclusion of this as a priority in the 2022 guidelines. Without that extra level of investigation, partners often make incorrect assumptions about what the barriers are. So, for example, we had a situation where some work was done with culturally diverse families. 2 areas spoke to kindergarten teachers about what the barriers were for families enrolling in kindergarten, and they cited translated materials or lack thereof. A 3rd area spoke with community as well, and they found that focus families were often illiterate in their home language, and even interpreters were not always the answer, because they needed to hear about kindergarten from a person they trusted in community. So while that information makes the response a little bit more difficult, it also means you don't spend time going down a path that won't necessarily help community. So in that instance, the area dealt with the feedback by setting up a morning tea with a really well-known community member at the kindergarten service. And that allowed families to ask lots of questions and feel culturally safe. And it was far more effective than simply translating the resources. So I would highly recommend taking a little longer to fully understand what's happening in your area, so that the work of the partnership knows precisely what to focus on and is more likely to achieve positive outcomes. The inputs are all the resources needed to implement strategies, so we'll include the partner organisations, community representatives, and any policies or frameworks that might support the work. Before finalising strategies, it's important to identify the short-term outcomes the site's trying to achieve. So if you've done that deep dive I mentioned earlier, then the short-term outcome area should be fairly obvious, and there's 6 of those that are available in the Best Start Handbook that you'll be able to choose from, such as cultural safety for Aboriginal families or service accessibility, for instance. But this is where you also articulate the stretch goals for the work to help understand whether you've made an improvement with the work. So once these are sorted, the strategies are how you'll get there. And once again, more information is found in the Best Start Handbook, so I won't go into too much more detail on that. So to best support this, fund holders can do a number of things. Firstly, provide any data that you have available that might support identification of the children who are missing out in your area, or that may be able to be used to measure improvement. Encourage a facilitator to actively seek community input around the barriers that are being faced. If it's not the facilitator, working out who in your organisation or some other, maybe it's in the partnership that could be actively seeking that community engagement. Ensure your facilitator has access to all resources and supports provided to facilitators, including MCRI training and handbooks. And as a fund holder, you may be aware of other local initiatives such as the Compact or Foundation House Communities of Practice or called outreach workers, etc. Similarly, partners may bring understanding of other local priorities such as kindergarten improvement advisors from the department that oversee school readiness funding planning. It's important that Best Start complements work that is happening in the area rather than competing. So fund holders might be able to bring a strategic lens to the logic model development as well.
The way it was done originally in the original guidelines, you develop your logic model and then ask community later, which didn't feel right. But during the process, having feedback from community and then developing a logic model based on what the community is saying is paramount to what we do, because we could guess what is happening, but without the community telling us what changes needs to be, we wouldn't be able to build the logic model properly. We could guess and then just do it, but is that really the right way to do it? But I sit through the whole process, not the whole process, but that let them develop it based on the feedback, see the draft, offer advice until we get to a point where we can sign off. So that's how I support, or in the past, how I've supported the facilitator to develop the logic model.
So performance measure 3, this really is the crux of Best Start. It also has a lot of elements to it, so we will break it down. The first aspect is that the partnership must have developed stretch goals that can be measured with data. So very intentionally stretch goals. They don't need to be met as such, but they're goals that partners set where if the whole service system is working effectively, the target will be met. So, for example, it might be that an area had 300 2-year-old key ages and stages visits conducted in 2023, representing around 50% uptake. So the partnership reflects on why children have been missing out and decide that if they took steps to overcome some of those barriers to participation, they could increase uptake by about a third. So set the target at 400 children for 2024, which would be 66% of eligible 2-year-olds. So it's important to note there's no penalty for not being able to achieve the target, but it does give all partners a good sense of what the numbers mean as they progress through 2024. So, for example, in this instance, once they hit 300, they know they've hit the same figure as in 2023. And so anything from here is an improvement. But as they start to support more children to attend their 2-year-old key ages and stages visit, they can see that how their work is actually impacting on the target, and they know that they're improving on the previous year, which tends to lead to more buy-in. And importantly, this funding requirement requires a commitment from all partnership members to be doing the Best Start work. We added local organisations as there might be some instances where an organisation is not a direct member of the partnership, but is very clearly doing work aligned with Best Start that can be supported by the Best Start facilitator and included as evidence of Best Start work in the area. The partnership may consider including those organisations into the future, but may only be time-limited involvement. So, for example, there may be a committee of management run kindergarten that's focused on improving access and inclusion of their service using school readiness funding that's focused on cultural safety for Aboriginal children and families. While that kindergarten itself may not be part of the partnership, if the Best Start site is focused on improving the cultural safety of kindergartens in their area, it would make sense to work with the kindergarten to test some changes in practice to measure the impact. Now, obviously, these have to be recorded onto the portal, but the final part of this is around active progress through implementation of change ideas through plan, do, study, act cycles. There's several ways that fund holders can support facilitators to meet this requirement, including the very simple yet important one of understanding and promoting the approach. So often this alone provides significant impact on Best Start work occurring as it creates an appropriate authorising environment for the work to occur. Once again, ensuring the facilitator is able to engage with the community to hear their feedback on what the barriers to participation are and how they can be overcome. And fund holders can ensure that facilitators have the skills to coach others in conducting a PDSA and recording it on the Best Start portal. The coaching role is a significant part of the Best Start facilitator role, and it requires sound knowledge of improvement science, the ability to influence others, and the ability to collect and interpret data as part of the PDSA cycle. It's also really important to remember that PDSAs should be small, short-term changes, short-term and changes in practice. And they shouldn't require any money to implement, should be able to be started next week. So this is why it sometimes feels like core business to participants, but it is about doing their core business with sufficient intent that it measures the impact of the PDSA work. It's also hoped that the collaborative impact, the cumulative impact of all of those small changes will have a significant impact on the service system. But just a reminder that this is the link to the Best Start portal. So if any fund holder doesn't have access, request that your facilitator add you. It is really important, as then you'll be able to have oversight of the work that's occurring. So we'll now hear from Johnny on the role he played in achieving this performance measure at his site.
When the new changes happened, it was really hard to get people or other services to buy into doing PDSAs. But if you use an example like cultural safety with an early years service, you talk about there's so many steps to get to where you need. So in order for a service to get to be culturally safe, you may need 100 steps, but doing all these little things we try to talk about things that are cost effective, time effective, all those things, so that they don't have to spend stupid amounts of time and money to make things happen. It could be policy changes, it could be just systems changes and things like that, so that they got time to do that stuff. But the facilitator we had in the role previously, I called her a bit of a stalker, because stalk services and make sure that they're doing what they're doing, but also essentially they're a coach, making sure that they're coaching the services to be able to do what they, to do the PDSAs. Because really, it took me a while to get my head around that they're only short-term, there could be 2-week activities that you do. So you test it, evaluate it. If it worked, you adopt it. If it didn't, you may need tweaking, adapt it. If it didn't work at all, just abandon it and then go again. So understanding the adopt, adapt, and abandon helps make the PDSAs achievable, if that makes sense. I should add in that, being a part of the Best Start committee, or that governance committee, whatever it is called, that's important in getting those that work in the earlier services to engage and be a part of it. I've always held the belief that if people feel a part of something, then they're most likely going to contribute. So putting it, getting them to be part of the Best Start is also coming to those meetings, and then you have them around the table, then you can actually just say, how do you feel about doing stuff like this? You've got the decision makers sitting at the table. So if the leaders, if there's a kinder group like we have here emerge, if their boss sits here, then she filters down, you just need to work with the Aboriginal community, particularly the Best Start, to make some changes. Then that's better to have them, the decision makers, than the actual workers on the ground who can choose whether they're not to do it. Always need the people at the higher level decision makers to be able to enforce those changes, or to make sure they work with us.
So performance measure 4 is simply that all reports are submitted by the due date. This means that quarterly reports need to be submitted to the portal by the end of the month following the quarter. So for January to March, the reports are due on the 30th of April, April to June, 31 July, etc. So quarterly reports automatically capture information that's held on the portal, such as PDSA cycles, and it isn't intended for these reports to be particularly lengthy. It's just about identifying the key learning from the work that's being done. So once they're completed by the facilitator, they're submitted to the Early Childhood Improvement Branch for approval. The quarterly reports will also be discussed in quarterly monitoring meetings that the department holds with fund holders. There are 2 other reports due. The financial report must be uploaded to the portal by 31 July each year, previous financial year. These reports follow a similar format each year and should be completed by someone with financial oversight of the program, such as a finance officer, CEO, etc. It'll be dependent on your own organisation context. These reports break down costs into administration, which again, not more than 20%, and the costs associated with employing the facilitator. And then finally, the annual report summarises the Best Start work over the previous 12 months, which is due by 31 January for the calendar year. We'll now hear from Johnny on how this particular performance measure, particularly around the annual reporting, has been supported at Coolum.
Supporting the facilitators in the annual report is actually making sure that you understand what's happening throughout the year for Best Start. I look at previously when I did manage Best Start, draft was always sent to me first, and then we sat down with yourself to go through the annual report, because we always talked about what we're going to answer pre the meeting, so that we knew what we were going to talk about. So yeah, you got to at least be part of it to understand what's happening, and so that you can provide at least a decent report and on time.
So just a recap on the funding requirements. Funding can only be used to employ a facilitator and the costs associated with that. Facilitator must be employed for 80% of the year. The logic model must be produced. Partners must record PDSAs on the portal that work toward stretch goal achievement. And all reports must be submitted on time. So we'll now switch to reflecting on what Best Start looks like in. The first aspect to understand relates to partnerships and the associated governance structures. So essentially, partnerships are composed of organisations that work together to address barriers to participation. In the old iteration of Best Start, it was really important to have robust partnership agreements with specific, like the specification rather of quorums and voting rights, etc. But this was largely due to the shared responsibility for acquitting any brokerage funding. So given that there's no longer any brokerage, there is no requirement for a legally binding partnership agreement. It should essentially be an in-principle agreement to commit to working collaboratively to achieve the Best Start outcomes using Best Start methodology. And sites have discretion as to the appropriate breadth of their partnership agreement based on their local context. Another thing just to point out is there shouldn't be much to vote on anymore. The idea is that Best Start is focused on organisations making small changes to their practice to have a cumulative impact on overcoming barriers to participation. As such, partners really don't need to vote on whether another organisation will make changes in their practice. So just to be clear, while we have a standard partnership agreement template on the website that sites may use if they choose, these can be adapted as appropriate for the local context. But if you could please provide a copy of your proposed agreement to your local early childhood improvement branch representative, just so they can provide guidance if needed. In terms of governance structures, we don't specify exactly how this looks, and what works in one site may not translate into the context of another. But in general terms, there are three key aspects. The first is the authorising group. This should be the group of decision makers that can set the authorising environment for Best Start work to be done and create the strategic direction of the work. The next is potential working groups. These may be broken down based on the different short-term outcome area a site is focusing on. So, for example, there might be a working group that looks at service accessibility across both MCH and kindergarten, and another one that looks at cultural safety in kindergarten specifically. And those working groups would line up with the logic model. Another example might be working groups that focus on cohorts of children. For example, there might be a working group that focuses on children from a refugee background, and another that focuses on children out of home care, another that focuses on children with disability or developmental delay. However, these are structured in a local context. They should involve a group of people that are able to do the work of Best Start. And finally, there are improvement teams. These are generally really small groups of 3 to 4 people that reflect collaboratively on PDSA cycles and determine whether to adopt, adapt or abandon the PDSAs. These groups meet the most frequently of the three and should include a variety of individuals with different expertise to ensure the reflection on the next step is not just completed by the person that completed the PDSA cycle. So these are the key aspects of Best Start governance, but it is important to understand that you're able to contextualise what these structures look like. So in one of our larger local government sites, there's a really flat governance group that includes all three of these aspects very successfully. However, in others, there are the three full levels that are very separate groups that also operate successfully. So we don't prescribe how it will look, but it must achieve all three of those aspects. And as fund holders, supporting your facilitator in identifying which will work best in your context is extremely helpful. Now, I would also like to highlight that if you Google CCCH Best Start, you will find a page that I'm showing here. This is from the Centre for Community Child Health Supporting Best Start Measurement and Change page. Page has a number of resources, including the Best Start Improvement Approach Guide that goes into great depth on how to use improvement methodology in the Best Start context. So I've referenced it a couple of times, but mentioned that you have to go to the guide to go into great detail. This is where you find that guide. There's also a series of Best Start orientation videos that are invaluable for guiding new facilitators, or even refreshers for more established facilitators. There's also some really interesting webinars from international guest speakers and others that are specific to Best Start. And there is also a promising practices section that looks at what's been learnt from Best Start sites. There's currently 3 papers that focus on different aspects of Best Start. So the first is how to facilitate quality improvement, and is really quite invaluable for new facilitators to understand the key skills for Best Start facilitators in coaching others or improvement methodology. Might also be useful for fund holders when they're looking to replace their facilitator to reflect on the skills that you might be looking for in a potential Best Start facilitator. And then there's papers on how to increase participation in early years and ideas for improving kindergarten participation. So really handy resources and a very quick snapshot of Best Start that both facilitators and fund holder managers may find useful. Another source of PDSA examples is found on the gallery tab of the portal. Anyone with access to the portal can review these. They can serve as inspiration for your own site, or you can also encourage your facilitator to share promising PDSAs themselves on this gallery tab. So really useful place for finding lots of different inspiration. Because we have been hearing from Dalkaya Aboriginal Best Start throughout this presentation, I thought I'd share some of the ideas that they've tested, so they've got an understanding of the size and scope of the PDSAs. These are only a few examples, but this one was an EYM that updated their policies and procedure documents to include frameworks alongside, to include Aboriginal frameworks alongside VALDA for planning purposes. In this one, there was an added question to the enrolment form about what would be the barriers to attendance for children. So this question was discussed as part of the orientation process for all new families, and it was a genius change because it meant that the teacher was not singling out any one family. So it implied that it was natural that you may have barriers to attendance at kindergarten. It showed that the teacher wanted every child at their service all the time, making families and children feel valued. And it also meant that if attendance became an issue later in the year, the teacher could contact families to check in if everything was okay, because this discussion had been had at the start of the year. This meant it didn't feel like they were being checked up on or that there was something wrong with them. It felt like a caring call based on that earlier conversation. Really excellent PDSA. A new form was trialled for referrals to allied health and paediatricians because families were reporting it was taking a long time for them to get a call back if they contacted these services themselves. So this form improved the time it took for families to get their children seen by the professionals. There are countless examples of services introducing aspects of Aboriginal culture into their programming, which hopefully everyone across the state will be able to report in some way these days. But in Horsham, this led to families reporting that they were feeling welcomed at services for the first time ever. This was a massive change and has only improved since this was first reported back in 2017. An Aboriginal father reflected on the inappropriateness of the cultural conversations that were being had with the non-Aboriginal mother in his presence without any discussion with him, and it led to new processes around engaging fathers more broadly in the MCH appointments as appropriate. So in this next video, Johnny reflects on one of the more successful PDSA generation ideas their site has had. And it's important to note that even though the original idea is not a change in practice, because it was used to generate many PDSAs, it was seen as the foundational work.
we did a program where we a PDSA with one of the service providers and did some training around how to engage with Aboriginal community, and the what happened after that and the improvements that we got was still we could still capture that data, which we didn't have before. So I would encourage Best Start providers to, nothing is unachievable in what you probably want to do. It's just how you do it to be able to capture the data that you need, so that it shows that it's actually making a difference. Because if you think it's going to make a difference, it's how you do it in the PDSA to make it work. It can be done. I've already proved it. Well, not I, but Gorm has proved that it can be done. But even after you did the PD, the PDSAs that come out of doing the PD, we did 2 groups of around 25 each, and I think out of that we got about another 10 PDSAs on the back of doing the PD. So that's already an improvement in itself, because they weren't even thinking about it before, did the training, and then another 10 PDSAs out of the same organisation. Win-win.
So we've covered some of the resources that are available throh Murdoch Children's Research Institute's Centre for Community Child Health, and the department continues to engage MCRI to provide support to facilitators through learning networks, portal support and induction for new facilitators, as I mentioned. But another important partner has been working with the Best Start program since its inception in 2002. The Victorian Aboriginal Community Services Association Limited, or VACSA, employs 2 project officers annually to support and provide advice to Best Start sites on how to improve their cultural safety and work more collaboratively with the Aboriginal community. In addition, the project officers provide more dedicated support to the Aboriginal Best Start sites. Also, there is an Aboriginal Best Start forum that is usually held annually. We've been sort of impacted a little bit through the COVID years, but generally speaking, this is held face-to-face in Northcote each year. But this is why it's really important that fund holders advise the area office as soon as there's any changes to their facilitator, just to ensure that the appropriate supports can be accessed. Now, noting that this presentation will be uploaded online and people can watch at any time, if you do have any questions after this session as well that you don't feel have been answered, feel free to email myself via the beststart@education.vic.gov.au web email inbox, and happy to answer any of those questions. Alternately, the Early Childhood Improvement Branch should always really be your first point of contact. If you don't have the contact details for your local ECIB, you can find it on the department website, or email the Best Start inbox and we can direct you to your local contact. And as we wind up this presentation on supporting Best Start from the perspective of fund holders, I will throw it over to Johnny for his final thoughts.
We trialled it in a school setting to see if the Best Start methodology would work in a school setting, and it actually did. So it's not that it doesn't work, it's always about the people that are facilitating the program, and even like you're saying, the organisation buying into the methodology, so that testing things, get the data, did or didn't work. If you still believe in it, adapt it, and then go again until you find something that does work. And if something completely doesn't work because people just can't make it work, then totally abandon it and find something else and start again. Simple.
Okay, so that is the end of the presentation, and as you can tell by my voice, it really is croaky, so I'm glad that I did pre-record that, but I apologise because it's not just a way of presenting. But were there any questions that anyone had that we can kind of go through at this point? Oh, Pam, sorry, I didn't see you.
Sorry, I did put my hand up. I didn't know whether to talk or put the hand up or how.
Yeah, sorry about that.
So, so thanks for that presentation. It was really good. So, it's given me some food for thought. So, just 2 very quick questions. So the first one was in relation to the underspend. So just say, for example, a fund holder does have an underspend, and you said that, you know, it could be only used to employ another person if that's what they wanted. But given the importance of what Johnny was saying about the qualifications of the facilitator, could you also use those dollars for qualifications for the
Professional
facilitator
development's
to
allowed
give
as
him-
well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anything,
Okay.
so whether it's professional development of the partnership or the facilitator, that's 100% acceptable.
Yeah, that's good. And
Yeah.
the other thing is, so with your annual report, which is from January to December to January, whatever way you want to look at it.
January, December,
And-
yeah.
Yeah, and you've got your financial report, which is from July till end of June.
Mhm.
Why are they like that? Why can't we?
Because what happened originally, we had, so the financial report needs to follow the financial year, given our financial reporting system in SAMS. What was the problem was when we aligned the Best Start annual reporting, that the one that's now January to December. The problem with that was that what was happening, people were, so you'd start the process. So logic model development would happen around May to June kind of thing, usually, sometimes a little bit later. So by the time work actually started, it was usually not really kicking in until about August. And so then what was happening, you go a couple of months where there'd be a bit of momentum being built. And then instead of being able to maintain that momentum, as we know, sort of November, December, everything kind of starts to wind down, people go on leave. So what we would have is this real lull. And so we didn't actually have an opportunity to maintain the momentum of the work. And so when we were reflecting on that, we thought that a simple change to that, rather than trying to force people into a situation that was clearly just not going to work, because obviously when you came back after January, then you also had new staff that might have had to come across it, and so by the time you started to get them engaged, we know with kindergarten services, for instance, you're probably not going to get much traction until about March in terms of engagement. And so if that was going to be the case, and then all of a sudden you're reviewing your logic model again in sort of May, June, we just weren't getting enough. We were kind of getting sort of two-month periods where any kind of work was happening. So the only solution that we found to that, given the limitations of the financial reporting having to be on the financial year, it was really just to switch the annual reporting to that calendar year model. So it's not ideal, but it is best we've got in terms of being able to allow that, I guess, momentum to continue throughout the year.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Did you want to elaborate any further, Pam, on the backsell supports?
I think you explained it pretty well. Yeah, like you mentioned, we have been around since the existence, so way back in 2002. So we were part of the implementation of all sites across the state. So yeah, so we've got a fair bit of knowledge in terms of setting up and the importance of partnerships, and the PDSAs and all that sort of stuff has come along a little bit later. So, but it's a really important part of the new way of operating and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, like we said, we've got our two facilitators there. So we've got Francie and both Janelle who have logged in today. So they'll wave if they've got their videos on. If you haven't already met, you probably already met them if you sit around the table as part of the partnerships for the sites that you manage. But yeah, if you haven't met them, please, extend an invitation and get to know them, because they are very knowledgeable in what they do. They've got a lot of knowledge in relation to previous employment from before they came across into Vaxol and that sort of stuff. So yes, that's what we're there for. So definitely use us and myself as well. So but yes, we're here to support. So if there's anything that is need or anything that in terms of linking into the community, that is what we're here for. So yeah, so welcome, the queries and the phone calls.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Nice to see Janelle popping next to Francie. Any other questions anyone had before we wrap up today? One of the things I did want to just state on the record is apologies that this has taken so long to actually happen. I feel like we've left fund holder managers out in the dark a little bit for quite some time, and so apologies on that, but better late than never. So hopefully this information today just kind of gives you that bit of a refresher. I'm hoping it won't come as too much of a surprise, but just to make sure that everyone's feeling comfortable with the approach. So. Excellent. All right. Well, I'll wrap up now, and any other questions that you might have after the session, feel free to email. Thank you.
Thank you.